So, great to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on our podcast. Maybe we could start by explaining where we are and what you're doing here and who you are and how did you arrive in science and to this date.
Sure, yeah, of course. So where are we? You want to tell us where we are?
So this is South Africa, and we're looking at the Southern Ocean, which is full of whales, and it's the reason that Matthew is here studying them, I guess.
Yeah. So I work with some local groups, universities here, researchers here that study the whales that feed or breed here in South Africa, but then migrate to the Southern Ocean to do most of their feeding, which they do in waters around the Antarctic. But of course, those whales in those areas are really, really hard to access, really hard to study. And so if we want to measure them, which is what we do with drones and things like that, if we want to sample them, take biopsies, put tags on them, assess their health and things like that, it's much easier to do that here where we have access to them right off the coast versus in the Southern Ocean, which is, of course, very, very hard to access. So that's why we're here. And it's such a special place. So yeah, it's great to meet you here.
Yeah, I agree. It's a wonderful place. I love being in South Africa. Tell me a little bit more about your career in science. How did you arrive?
How did I get here?
Yeah, how did you get here? Yeah,
yeah, right. It's a little bit of a convoluted story. I think probably like most people's stories are in whatever career they have. So I'm originally from New York City, and that might seem like a weird place to be excited about science and nature and things like that. But I can't really explain it. I think like most kids, I just was fascinated by animals, wildlife, nature, things like that from a very young age. But unlike a lot of my peers where they lost that interest, or maybe didn't lose it, but it was superseded by what they considered to be more serious professional pursuits, whether that's to go be a lawyer or a businessman or something like that. I just never lost that passion, and I could never really see myself doing something other than working in the environment, working in conservation, understanding how humans are impacting the environment. And yeah, I mean, just kind of been driven by a lifelong fascination of animals that I had since I was a kid growing up in New York. Originally, I was really interested in birds, and then that turned into an excitement about seabirds. And the thing that I loved about seabirds was that you could go to a colony where they breed. So seabirds, they're out at sea, they're foraging and all over the ocean. They're essentially taking samples of this amazing ocean behind us that's very inaccessible. And then they're coming back to land to these colonies where they all breed next to each other. And you can just go to one of those colonies as a researcher and sample them, basically ask them scientifically questions about how are you doing? How is the ocean ecosystem doing? What sort of pollutants are you experiencing? What sort of new climate regimes are you experiencing? How is that affecting your reproductive success or your growth or things like that? And that was really always very exciting to me about seabirds, and just the fact that we think of birds as these kind of probably like primarily a terrestrial sort of animal, right? We go to the park and we see birds. We go to the coast, even the beach, and we see birds on the beach. But I'm talking about these birds going to the open ocean, things like albatross and petrels. They don't see land for years at a time. They only come to land to breed. And so those are the types of animals that got me really excited in marine science. And then that sort of transitioned to whales, because whales and birds have to deal with the same challenges, finding food on a very large scale. And they face a lot of the same conservation challenges, right? So interactions with fisheries or climate change, things like that. So I got into whales through seabirds, and now I've been most recently primarily been studying whales. And a big topic that I think about a lot of is pollution, but also climate change, overfishing, things like that. So yeah, that's kind of how I got here today.
And you studied in California and then spent most of your research, did your PhD?
Yeah, exactly. So I did my PhD at UC Davis, finished in 2017, and I've been working in Monterey, California ever since at the Hopkins Marine Station, California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as a Sea Grant Fellow. So I've done a variety of things in marine science since finishing my PhD in 2017.
Very fascinating. So I guess one of the big topics that you already talked a little bit about is what is limiting the food cycle in the marine food web, but I mean, maybe also with birds. And I guess there's these two big trends. One is climate change. So maybe you could dive into the effects that climate change has. But then also the other big topic of our podcast was all around iron levels and how their impact like our primary productivity,
Right.
diatoms, krill. So I've seen some studies that connect the two. There's like less dust deposition on the ocean due to climate change, and that's why there's like a more and more iron limitation here in the Southern Ocean. But you're probably way deeper into the topic than I am.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of different ways to approach this. So is your thing that you're primarily interested about is like, are animals at sea suffering food limitation, and what are the causes of that? Is that one of the things you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Each one of these things is a conversation that we could have for hours, right? Each one of these mini topics. And so I think there's a variety of factors that are influencing animals' ability to find food at sea. And climate change is certainly a big driver of that. And the reason is because climate change is affecting ecosystems really quickly, quicker than animals have a chance to respond to those changes in their environment. So if changes happen over a slow enough period of time, animals are able to adapt and eventually over many generations, if they need to, evolve to sort of meet changes in the environment. But I think one of the things that maybe people don't realize about climate change, or the average person doesn't realize about climate change, is that we spend a lot of time focused on the absolute temperature, right? Like it's 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C above industrial. Oh my God. And, those numbers are important for certain things, depending on what you're concerned about. But it's not so much for organisms anyway. It's not so much the absolute number. I mean, for example, whales, they give birth, the big baleen whales that we're here studying, they give birth in very warm waters that are 20 plus degrees C, and then they go migrate to waters that are 2 degrees C. So the difference of a half a degree Celsius doesn't matter to them. What matters to them is where their prey is going to be, right? And that can change very rapidly because their prey can be very responsive to small changes in temperature, and they just want to go to where they're most comfortable, to where they can survive the best. And the whales have to adapt quickly to find where those prey patches are. And so with climate change, again, it's not the amount of temperature, like 1.5 degrees C, 2 degrees C, it's how quickly we've changed that course. So it's, you think about those graphs of climate change where it's like this, It's not so much, again, the number on the y-axis, but it's the slope of that line. And I think that's really important when you look at climate change, the change in whatever it is, CO2 concentration or ocean temperature or air temperature over the last however many hundreds or thousands of years. And you see it kind of wobbling, and then it goes up a little bit. And then in the last about 70 years, it just basically is like a vertical line. And it's that rate of change that is causing a lot of animals at sea to begin to sort of slowly starve. I don't want to be too dramatic about it. It's not like, you have just like animals starving all over the place, right? But it becomes even marginal changes in how hard it is for these animals to find food over time can lead to big effects in how many babies they can produce, and ultimately then whether or not their population grows or shrinks, right? And so in a big, broad way, that's how climate change is impacting species like seabirds and whales, predators, ocean predators, right? Is not through the direct effects of temperature, but is through the effects of temperature on the base of the food web. So phytoplankton, zooplankton, forage fish, which is what all of these animals that people get excited about, whether it's, because you're watching a wildlife documentary or because you're here studying them, those are the animals that we're sort of get most excited about, but they are responding to changes at the lower portions of the food web. And those animals at the lower portions of the food web are very responsive to these little changes in temperature and other sorts of abiotic conditions of their environment. And so that, particularly for whales in the Southern Ocean, as we've had the amount of ice in the Southern Ocean decrease a number of days and extent how far north it reaches. So we've had that shrinking less and less each year. And so as a result, the whales have to go further and further to find food. Krill populations aren't as healthy as they once were. Krill are the main food that these whales eat in the Southern Ocean, and so on. So that's part of a much bigger story here, but that's where I'll leave that.
So maybe we can dive into this story. So what decreases the health of the krill population?
Yeah,
is it the quantity or is it the quality?
Yeah. So you're talking about just krill in general, like what's affecting krill? Like what are the threats to krill generally? Yeah. So I want to be clear. When we talk about krill, around the world, there are many, many species of krill. It's like saying sparrow or duck or something like that. Like there's many different species of sparrows or ducks, right? There's many different species of krill, but I think primarily the krill we're talking about is Antarctic krill, right? Which is, Euphausius.
The one behind us.
Yeah. And Antarctic krill will be way behind us. This is, this is technically behind us. This is where the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean meet. And then to the south of that is the Southern Ocean. So right back there, but many, many miles away is Antarctica, right? Yeah, and so Antarctic krill would be thousands of miles from us, but in that direction. Yes, exactly. And so that Antarctic krill is just one species, Euphausia superba, and it is one of the most biomassive species on Earth. So to give you an idea of how much krill is out there, Antarctic krill, from now on, unless we say otherwise, when we say krill, we mean this one species of krill, Antarctic krill. And to give you an idea of how much Antarctic krill there is on the planet today, I could just say it like this. The amount of biomass, which is total weight of this one species of krill and of all people on Earth, are very similar. They are very close numbers. People is a little more, but it's like they are very close numbers. And so Antarctic krill is one of the most biomassive single species on planet Earth.
Just to get this right. So we have as much kilograms in Antarctic krill that we have in humans on Earth.
About. Humans are a little more. So humans are about 500-600 million metric tons, and krill is about 300 to 400 million metric tons. But those numbers are shockingly similar for an animal that almost none of us have ever seen. Some of us don't even know about, and individually are this big, right? So that big. So
it's fascinating. Is it the biggest, like after humans, krill, or is there like another animal that has?
That's a great question. In terms of one single species, like things that you might hear is like, well, there's more biomass in ants, or in let's say ants, right? But there's a ton of species of ants, or mesopelagic fish. There are hundreds of species of mesopelagic fish, right? So I think that for one single species, Antarctic krill is definitely at the top. I can't say off the top of my head if it is number one after people. In fact, the number one species on the planet in terms of weight now, of course, is not people or krill, it's livestock, various species of livestock. So chickens, cattle, things like that. But in terms of wild animals, krill is, if not one of the top 3 to 5 most biomassive wild species on Earth, particularly for macroscopic animals. That's animals that you can see without a microscope. And so there's far more krill on Earth than there are any type of bird or elephant or whale. And so just by numbers alone, you can hopefully start to see how important these animals must be to the functioning of the Antarctic ecosystem, but also to the health of the planet.
Interesting. So, and how's the krill doing? Is it growing? Is it decreasing in population?
Yeah. So there's a lot of people working on that question. It's a really complicated one, but I think in general, if I can summarize the research that I'm aware of, in general, krill are not doing great, which is not to say that they're trending toward extinction. That's not the case either. There's still, like I said, hundreds of millions of tons of krill in the Southern Ocean. However, you also have to think about how many animals rely on them. Every penguin you think of, well, not every, but most penguins you think of, most of the big whales we think of, most seals in Antarctica, basically all these Antarctic animals, all these iconic Antarctic predators that we associate with Antarctica, they eat krill, some of them exclusively. A lot of the whales, for example, that is the only thing they eat, is Antarctic krill. So in general, what we've seen over time, over recent years with Antarctic krill is that their populations have shrunk and contracted poleward, so south, toward the South Pole. And this is problematic because krill sort of need huge open ocean spaces to carry out their life cycle. So krill can live to be 7 years old. They commonly live to be 5 or 6, which is very long lived actually for a little ocean shrimp. That's really long lived. So we have krill off the coast of California. They're much smaller, but they're still krill, different species. And they only live for 1, 2, maybe 3 years at most. Whereas Antarctic krill are living normally twice that long, sometimes 3 times that long, right? So that's an important component. Antarctic krill needs large open ocean spaces. They need sea ice and different types of ocean floor habitat. They need a huge ecosystem that is thriving for them to be doing well. And right now, climate change is impacting the Antarctic ecosystem, particularly the Antarctic ecosystem south of South America, the area known as the Antarctic Peninsula, where a lot of the krill breed. And it's also where heavy krill fishing is happening right now, literally right now. The multiplicative effects of things like climate change, krill fishing, and other stressors are compressing those krill populations, putting stress on those krill populations. And over time, over the course of decades, we've seen krill populations, or the data suggests that krill populations are declining, which is not to say they're going extinct or anything like that, but it is concerning because we want an Antarctic ecosystem with a lot of krill for a lot of different reasons. So not so great.
What is Antarctic krill feeding? What is it?
Yeah. So Antarctic krill, they are omnivores like people. They eat other zooplankton, things like copepods they really like. They'll eat other krill. They'll cannibalize krill. But one of the main things they like are little plants. So things like diatoms, these ocean phytoplankton, and they graze on ocean phytoplankton, largely diatoms, these silica encased phytoplankton species, of which there are many, many different species of diatoms in the Southern Ocean. And so, so krill eat a bunch of different things, from other zooplankton to phytoplankton. But they're really relying on phytoplankton, yeah.
It's so interesting that they eat their own kind.
Yes,
I've never heard that before.
Yes, indeed.
So krill eat diatoms at the surface of the ocean, but also deep down, right? So they eat the entire biological carbon pump in the ocean is being...
Yes, they'll eat anywhere in the water column. They do eat a lot at the surface, but recent research, and this is, again, one of the things that's so exciting about working in marine science in this day and age, is that we have technology that's sort of opening this portal to a new world, a world that's always existed on our planet, but we've never been able to see or study or take any sort of observations or measurements of. And so recently we've been able to put cameras and other types of sensors and scientific equipment deep down into the ocean, Southern Ocean and elsewhere, to see that, yes, especially I think it's during the winter, the krill go down, they hang out at the seabed, and they eat detritus, and they eat the decomposing bits of other animals that have floated down from the surface, including the poop of other animals.
They eat the whole marine snow. Snow is their entire...
Yes. Okay. They'll kind of eat anything, and marine snow at any part in the water column, including at the seafloor, thousands of meters below the surface, or thousands of feet, at least 1,000 meters below the surface, is, all key components of what they're eating, yes.
I mean, if there's so many krill equivalent to humans, they seem to be quite relevant for the biological carbon pump of the ocean. So they seem to store a lot of carbon.
No, exactly. So they are really important animals in terms of how elements in the ocean are distributed between living and non-living things, because they have so much biomass in their species. There was a paper that came out in 2010 written by Stephen Nicol and colleagues that calculated that approximately a quarter of all iron, so that's 25% of all iron in the surface Southern Ocean, is inside of krill bodies, which is an unbelievable amount considering the volume of the water in the surface of the Southern Ocean. That 25% of this essential micronutrient for life is locked inside of krill. And you mentioned the carbon cycle. There's also our bodies, and krill bodies too, are roughly 20% carbon, give or take, right? What's 20% of, 300-400 million metric tons? It's a lot of carbon just in the krill bodies themselves. But I think the real important thing that krill, and not just krill, but mesopelagic fish and other sorts of diel vertical migrating animals, copepods, things like that, contribute to is what you mentioned, this biological carbon pump, right? Where we have a lot of the primary productivity. Initially, it's phytoplankton, things that grow and trap carbon using the sun's energy, the sun's rays. Eventually, that is either eaten by other animals, or it dies and sinks and begins to decay in the ocean's interior and at the seafloor. That process takes carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it away in the deep sea over time. And in fact, I believe the ocean carbon pump is believed to sequester, like 5 to 10 gigatons a year. So a huge amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, in the surface ocean, gets transported to the deep sea, where it's locked away for hundreds or thousands of years by just wildlife, things like krill, just living out their life cycle. And so this is a great example of an ecosystem service that's provided by the animals that surround us on this amazing planet. And, you're talking about 5 to 10 gigatons of krill per year by the biological carbon pump. That's all organisms in the ocean. That's equivalent to the annual carbon emissions of most countries around the world, right? It produced less than 5 to 10 gigatons. Not China or probably the US either, but many countries, these are equivalent numbers, right? So these animals are doing really important things, globally important things in the Southern Ocean. And so krill, they themselves have a lot of carbon locked in them, but when they die and sink, when they molt their exoskeletons, and that sheds off to the deep sea, when they poop, actually, krill fecal pellets is a huge component of marine snow in the Southern Ocean. So these different kind of just normal life processes that krill are engaging in anyway shuttle carbon to the deep sea. And I think in terms of the carbon cycle, that's probably the most important benefit. The most important way that krill benefits the carbon cycle is not through their biomass, that is a big part, but just through living their lives. The molting, the pooping, things like that is going to be really important for how much carbon krill can help us sequester.
If we go one level higher, if we go into the phytoplankton and primarily diatoms in the Southern Ocean, how are the diatom populations or non-diatom populations in the Southern Ocean doing? If most of what the krill eat are phytoplankton, how much of that is the percentage roughly is diatoms? How much are they eating non-diatoms?
Yeah, that
depends on what on the Southern Ocean is a lot of silica or less silica, right?
Yeah. So I think the answer to what krill are eating, what proportion of their diet is what, krill are very flexible in what they can eat, right? So the actual percentages or numbers I do not know off the top of my head, so I don't want to misspeak and guess, but I do know that krill are really very flexible, so they can shift what they're eating from diatoms to other types of phytoplankton, non-diatom phytoplankton, to other types of zooplankton, to detritus, marine snow, things you mentioned like that. So krill are very flexible in kind of what they can eat, but they do really like to eat diatoms when they're around. And the levels of diatoms, the species composition of diatoms depends a lot on the abiotic factors. So things like temperature and currents and nutrients available and things like that. And that really sort of sets the stage for what diatoms can be around in an ecosystem. You can kind of think of it like the way you have a garden, right? And so you can set up your garden in a bunch of different ways. You can have some shade or some sunlight, or have it be watered a lot or not watered a lot, or fertilized or not fertilized, or use this type of soil or that type of soil. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think it might be better or easier for people to think in terms of a system that they know about, like their garden or a park, some situation like that. But the ocean isn't really very different. Just because it looks kind of blue and homogeneous out there's a lot of different factors at play. Like I said, there's salinity, there's currents, there's nutrients, there's temperature, there's light, there's pollution, there's all kinds of different things. And those abiotic factors or non-living factors are what sets the stage for what types of diatoms can survive and thrive in different types of ocean conditions. And so you could go to the one spot in the ocean, sample at different times of year or between different years, and find very different compositions of diatom species, right? So there's hundreds, if not thousands, of diatom species in the world, certainly, but in the Southern Ocean specifically. And which species are most prevalent or outcompeting other species is going to vary based on the ocean conditions at any given time. So in terms of what the krill is eating, it's probably just what's around, and that can vary very significantly between seasons and between years.
Interesting. Here in the Southern Ocean, obviously way south of that, there've been 3 experiments done by the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, led by chief scientist Viktor Smedacek, together with Christine Klaas and others that were also on our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in low effects, they've studied the growth of copepods within the artificial algae patch they've created.
Right.
And what it has shown is that there is a rapid growth. So I think after iron addition of around 2 weeks of buildup of biomass, and then another 2 weeks of growth of copepods, and then sinking out of the diatoms. I think what these experiments have shown is that the zooplankton are reacting to iron or are reacting to more food, like a feast. Also, other experiments have shown that they also feast on the biomass, deep down in the ocean. So they'll just take whatever there is.
Yes. Yeah, and so I think what I would say is that what you mentioned, which is that the low effects experiment that was done, I think it was 2007 or something, 2008, these German experiments that you mentioned, these were studies that were really seminal to my development. I was reading them when I was a young scientist and was very inspired by them and by what they were finding and what they were doing. I thought it was really, really neat.
Yeah, I just want to pull up some slides so that we can look at the data.
Generally, what I'd say though, none of these big iron experiments, whether it was done by the Germans or Americans or British or whoever, there's about 12 or 13 big iron addition experiments done all over the world in places that are iron limited and would respond to iron additions. And none of those experiments specifically set out to look at the effects on organisms above phytoplankton. Zero. There was none of that. The one sort of example you mentioned is that low effects sort of study where they noticed, it seems like maybe even, I don't know, this would be a question for Christine or Victor for sure, but it almost seems like they saw that happening and they were like, oh, this is an interesting additional story, so we're going to also collect data and write a paper on that as well. But it wasn't the goal of that study. The goal of all of these iron addition experiments over the course of 20 years was to see what the response would be in phytoplankton, and whether or not ultimately it could sequester, capture, and sink out carbon. So it has been, I would say, very understudied, the effect of iron additions on animals, organisms of any type. The copepod example that you mentioned is the only one that I know of. And it's one study that was done sort of as a supplement to this bigger project that was being done on the effects of iron addition in iron-limited waters of the Southern Ocean. So I think the biggest research need in this field right now is to understand what the connections are between iron addition and organisms higher up in the trophic pyramid. So we know that there's, again, every single one basically of the iron addition experiments showed very convincingly that if you add iron to iron-limited waters, phytoplankton will respond, right? Just like if you add fertilizer to your garden, at least initially, your plants will probably respond positively by growing and producing more leaves or more fruits and things like that. What we have less information on, almost no information on, is the effect of that then on things like krill or fish or whales. The copepod example that you mentioned is the only example that I know of. I mean, I have some guesses as to what might happen, but it's really just that. It's really just guesses. We need the science to actually do these experiments to be able to say positively or negatively or somewhere in between that adding iron to these iron-limited waters affects things like krill, whales, fish, etc. in these different ways, because we really don't know the answer to that yet.
So that's like the only experiment that has looked into it, and I think that's
the data is convincing.
Yeah, it's convincing.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
Yeah, maybe you could explain to us, like, what are we seeing here? How do we measure the zooplankton?
I was like 16 when this cruise was happening or something like that. So it was done many years ago now. But basically what happens is they fertilize a patch in the ocean, and you can use oceanographic measurements to decide where a good sort of enclosed parcel of ocean water is. So you can kind of contain that iron that you release. And then within that patch, that's like your experimental patch. And so you can measure the growth and the reproduction and the health of, for example, copepods or any other organism inside that fertilized patch as compared to outside that fertilized patch. And what they saw, and what you might expect to see if you anticipate iron to have a positive effect, is that those copepods, for example, in that fertilized patch have higher growth rates, have higher reproductive rates, they're fatter, they're healthier, they're doing better than the copepods found outside that patch. It's honestly kind of simple. It's a simple experiment, but what I want to preface that with is doing anything, any type of research in an open ocean. This is not a couple miles off the beach here. This is in the middle of the sea. Doing anything like that in the open sea is extremely challenging. And so, yes, it's a very simple design of an experiment, but it produced, like you said, pretty convincing results. And yeah, it was really a nice one to see. I think the issue then became that the iron fertilization experiments were kind of halted due to the London Protocol. Otherwise, maybe these types of experiments would have been carried out on things like whales and fish and krill and birds and things like that. But we just never had the opportunity because essentially international governments shut down the possibility of sort of adding iron to oceans for many, many years. And only in very recent years did people get excited to try to start doing it again. So it kind of stopped right as that copepod experiment was conducted. But yeah, the early data from that one experiment that exists was pretty convincing.
If you were to set up like a large copepod study, or like a large zooplankton study, like to research growth rates of copepods or krill or other zooplankton, and let's say we would do it in the Southern Ocean or maybe like in the North Pacific, also the Equatorial Pacific, how would an experimental design look like? If you were like the chief scientist, it was like $10 million budget. Like,
I hope they'd pick someone with a little more credentials. No. But What I would say is, I mean, honestly, kind of similar. It's basic stuff, but I'd want to see sort of convincingly, ideally with some sort of replicates, if possible, to see how robust the findings could be. But kind of the same idea where you have sort of experimental regions and control regions, and then you measure things like growth and reproduction of zooplankton in the experimental regions as compared to the control regions. Not that much more complicated than that, at least at first. And then you see what results you find, and then that helps guide your future experiments and so on. One of the things that's really interesting about studying zooplankton in this regard is that many species of zooplankton, this includes things like copepods and krill, many of those species are fairly flexible in how they can reproduce, so their reproductive timing, and they kind of are able to reproduce whenever the conditions are good, right? So it's just like, oh, there's a lot of food here, we're doing great. We can start to make eggs and have babies and stuff like that. Great. So that is helpful for us as compared to something, for example, like a whale, which is something I know better. I know the biology of a whale better than I know the biology of a copepod. But for example, if we were to study whales in this process, which would also be very, very interesting, we'd have to wait years for those data to come in because the whales would have to eat a bunch, then go migrate, then go have their babies, then come back. So it'd take a very long time. One of the great things about working with plankton and zooplankton in this regard is that it's a very tractable system to think about because they can live their life cycle very quickly and they can change their reproductive behaviors rapidly based on current environmental conditions. And so I would definitely start with things like zooplankton. I think krill would be a great one to start with, Antarctic krill, which this has never been done before for Antarctic krill. There's actually never been an iron experiment in a region where Antarctic krill live, never. So I think even just trying that in a small way, with one of the core goals being how does the krill respond to that iron addition? How long does it take the krill to respond? Do we see any negative effects of the iron addition? Because we can't necessarily assume there's going to be positive effects and no negative effects. Maybe it'll be a little bit of both. Maybe it'll be more negative than we think. Maybe it'll be more positive than we think, right? But we have to go into it with this sort of open mind. But right now that work just hasn't been done at all. So we have some guesses, we have some thoughts, but there is no data at all on how the ecosystem, in particular animals like krill or things that eat krill, would respond to this type of treatment.
It's very interesting. So you mentioned the reproduction cycles of whales. I think they reproduce within like 6 to 8 years.
Well, it depends on what species you're talking about.
Let's look at the blue whales. I think we have like this issue with the blue whales. They used to be like 200,000 or 300,000 blue whales. Now we're down to 1,400.
Yes.
And they're mostly here on like Southern Ocean.
Way. Right. So to put some numbers into perspective, I think the blue whales are a great one that you bring up because their numbers have changed so dramatically and they have not really recovered. So in 1900, right before we started hunting whales in the Southern Ocean, there were about 250,000, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, blue whales in the Southern Ocean. So about 250,000 blue whales in the Southern Ocean. When we were done whaling blue whales in the Southern Ocean, which ended legally, it ended in about 1960, but the Soviets continued harvesting them illegally into the 1970s. But in any case, in the span of one blue whale's lifetime, or one human lifetime, about 70 years, 75 years, we killed about 325,000 blue whales in the Southern Ocean in just 70 years. To give you an example of how many blue whales that is, on the entire planet today, blue whales live in every ocean besides the Arctic, basically. We have blue whales in the Atlantic and in the Pacific and still in the Southern Ocean, in the Indian Ocean. And every blue whale on the planet today numbers about 50,000. Whereas at the beginning of whaling, before whaling, there was over 250,000 in just the Southern Ocean. And in 70 years, we harvested over 300,000 blue whales in just the Southern Ocean. In the height of whaling, which for blue whales was about the 1920s, 1910s, so about a century, almost exactly a century ago, at the peak of whaling, we harvested as many blue whales per year as there are on the entire planet today. And even so, even about 70 years, roughly, give or take, since the last blue whale has been hunted in the Southern Ocean, we still have seen their population only recover very slightly. So whaling removed over 99% of all blue whales from the Southern Ocean, about 99.7%. So we did a really good job at trying to make blue whales extinct in the Southern Ocean. We didn't succeed, but we came really, really close. And now their population has recovered to about 3 to 4% of their historic numbers. So they've gone from about 0.5% to 3 to 4%. In 70 years, we should expect their population to grow more than that, over the course of 70 years. By comparison, we see fin whales and humpback whales, to other similarly sized, smaller, but still large whales, having recovered much, much better than the blue whales in the Southern Ocean. So yeah, blue whales are kind of this interesting story and this fascinating animal that's playing out right now in Antarctica.
You mentioned that they're kind of like gardeners before. What happens if a blue whale's defecating in the ocean?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not just blue whales, right? I think it's any type of whale. It's any type of, marine. Originally, what got me interested in this idea was the idea that marine birds, I mean, so one individual bird pooping over the ocean is probably not going to do much of anything. But for people who've studied seabirds, know that marine birds are often congregate in flocks that harbor hundreds of thousands or even millions of birds. And so when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of shearwaters or albatross or petrels, things like that, in a concentrated area, all sort of eating and pooping and mixing the water, churning the water about, we believe that can create this sort of fertilization effect. And so we think whales do this too. And this isn't my idea. This is an idea that, again, Victor Smeticek, Stephen Nicol, Joe Roman, and others have studied and written about and talked about for the last 20 years or so, certainly the last 15 years or so. And the idea is that whales are huge. Blue whales are the size of a Boeing 737 or an Airbus A320. So, I mean, it's just like a giant animal. And now you imagine an ocean, a Southern Ocean, that used to have 250,000 Airbus A320s swimming around, eating 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10 tons of krill a day. And they're pooping most of that out. And not only are they pooping most of that out, but most of what they're pooping out is the stuff that their body doesn't need. And so iron, whales, humans, krill, phytoplankton, we all need iron, but we need it in very, very, very tiny amounts. And so most of the iron that whales are ingesting in the krill that they eat ends up being pooped out. And so I've thought about whales, blue whales, but again, not just blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, right whales, whatever whales, as mobile krill processing plants. They take the nutrients in the krill that they're eating, their body digests them, and then they poop that out into the surface water of the ocean and essentially turn it into fertilizer. So in that way, we've written about whales, thinking about whales as gardeners. Maybe thinking of whales as ranchers would be better, but I think whales as gardeners is a better metaphor. So the idea that whales are sort of fertilizing their pastures where they're going to grow the diatoms that feed the krill, which is, of course, what they're eating. So that's the idea behind that.
So how much iron is a blue whale pooping in their life cycle?
That's a good question. Like an individual blue whale, that's a good question. One of the things that we calculated was that before whaling, blue whales recycled something about 10,000 tons of iron in the Southern Ocean at a population level. So that's 250,000 whales. So you'd have to kind of divide that, which is, I don't want to do on camera that like doing math on.
But I read something like 8 to 12 tons in the life cycle.
Yeah, I mean,
roughly correct.
It sounds like it could be, right? I mean, so again, iron exists in really small concentrations within animals, within the ocean and so on, but whales eat a ton or several tons every day that they're eating in the Southern Ocean, and they're pooping most of that out. So again, over the course of a 60, 70, 80, 100-year lifespan, I think it's certainly reasonable that a whale could be pooping out, 9, 10 tons of iron. But the other thing that we've just recently discovered, we just wrote a paper about this, I could share it with you if you'd like, is that it's not just that whales, and presumably other animals, but we studied this in whales, it's not just that whales are pooping out iron, but an important, though nuanced addition to this story is that iron itself, so if we just took iron and, sort of put it out in the ocean as these experiments did, most of that iron is lost very quickly from the ecosystem. So iron is insoluble in seawater, which means that it's really hard, if you just take iron dust and throw it out at sea, it's really hard for phytoplankton to take that iron up. So when you talk about dust blowing off the ocean and that fertilizes the ocean, it does, but that's because there's so much dust, but only maybe 1% of it actually gets into phytoplankton, right? But what's amazing about whales is that whales, just like people, have all these microbes, this gut microbiome, right? That we've, in humans, been learning more and more about every year. I love learning about the microbiome, and I don't know anything about it personally, but every time we learn about the microbiome, we learn how important it is to the way you and I live, to our health, to our reproduction. Everything about how we live and how we feel healthy and how we move through the world is affected by these trillions of little microorganisms in our guts. And so whales and other animals also have this microbiome. And so one of the things that we discovered recently was we collected samples of whale poop. We looked at the iron in the whale poop, with fancy chemical instruments. And what we found was kind of remarkable, which is that there are microbes in the whale's stomach that attach to the iron molecules in the krill, in the food that the whales are eating. And then when the whales poop out that iron with the microbes attached to it, it makes that iron much more bioavailable to the diatoms than it would otherwise be. So it's not just that whales are recycling iron, which is really important.
You're also making it more bioavailable.
Exactly. Yes.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned we killed 300,000, something like that.
Yeah.
300,000 blue whales. And let's say they defecate 10 tons of iron in their life cycle. So we removed 3 million tons of iron from the Southern Ocean by just killing whales.
I think one way to think about it too is it's not that whales introduced iron that didn't exist in the system. It's, again, thinking about whales as sort of these gardeners. They took iron that was in the system and essentially recycled it, used it and reused it and reused it and reused it. And what that means then is then you can spin off more production, more diatoms, and ultimately more krill, because you're taking those nutrients that all those things need and you're reusing it and reusing it and reusing it. I think we as humans have this sort of mindset, because when we think about oceans, what do we do to oceans? It's a one-way street, right? We take fish out, we take metals out, we do deep sea mining, right? And we're not returning anything. The animals that live in the ocean, whales, krill, whatever you want to talk about, those animals are eating things like we are, but we're pooping on land, aren't we? At least I'm doing most of my pooping on land. But animals like a whale that are eating at sea are also pooping at sea. And that sort of interaction is incredibly important because that allows this productivity to be maintained at higher levels than if these predatory animals like whales, but again, not just whales, birds, seals, fish, anything you can think of is present, you have more productive oceans. And when those animals aren't present, you have less productive oceans, simply because of these nutrient recycling services that animals like whales and others provide.
One of the reasons I mentioned the iron and the 3 million tons of iron that wasn't necessarily removed, but that didn't get recycled to the surface and become bioavailable, is that many people have this perception that iron ocean fertilization is a part of like geoengineering, where we're recklessly trying to mess with the ocean. But if we've already removed the recycling potential of iron in the ocean by killing those 300,000 blue whales and more of other whale populations, my new point of view is that adding iron to the ocean, if the data shows that it works, could be more seen like a restoration project rather than like an engineering project, because the geoengineering has already happened by industrial whaling, by industrial fishing. And one thing I always wonder, what other iron sources there are in the ocean. So one obviously comes from whales, but then there's also like upwelling. And I always wondered, how does upwelling of iron in the ocean work? So just show like a little bit of like the iron distribution on the planet. And you see that basically now here, south of South Africa, there's very little iron, and there's also these subtropical gyres where there's like no iron at all. So you have like iron deserts.
So so I think it's important. Let's talk briefly about where iron comes from. So on Earth, there is no shortage of iron. Iron is one of the top 5 elements found on Earth. It is a huge component of this planet. However, iron exists primarily in crustal material. So that is to say, the physical Earth that we associate when you touch the ground, that's where iron comes from, right? And the ocean is water, and there's not a lot of iron in water. So if you look at that map of where iron is distributed around the world's oceans, what do you notice? It's primarily by continents, right? Or it's where currents would take that water off of continents, right? There's several interesting things where that diverges from being nearby continents is if you look at here and what's going on here. It's like, well, there's the Kalahari Desert there. And you look at the North Atlantic and you're like, oh, what's going on up here? Well, the Sahara Desert is here. So there's loads of dust that are being blown off of the African continent into the open Atlantic Ocean, and that fertilizes the open Atlantic Ocean with iron. In the Pacific, which is way larger, about twice the size of the Atlantic, and way fewer land masses, there's a huge dearth of iron in vast parts of the Pacific. And in Antarctica, well, Antarctica itself, of course, is land, but it's mostly frozen. So there aren't rivers that are supplying iron to the open Southern Ocean. There aren't continental land masses down there. You know, if you look south of South Africa, where we are now, there's no land for a couple thousand kilometers until you get to the continent of Antarctica. And so as a result, there's not a lot of sources of iron to the open ocean in many parts of the open ocean, particularly the Southern Ocean. And so when you have situations where there is such a limited source of initial iron, then it it becomes even more important for those ecosystems to make the best use of the iron that they can by sort of recycling that iron, the limited iron that exists in that system over and over again, making the most of it kind of thing, right? And that's what animals like krill and whales are really good at naturally. And so you talked about the idea of iron additions as geoengineering, and it's gotten a bad rap because of that, but maybe we should reframe this as, what'd you call it?
Restoration.
Restoration.
Iron restoration.
And I think that it really depends on how it's done, because I could see if it's done recklessly, then that could be a total mess. If it's done responsibly, it could be a really positive thing. But I think the difference between whether or not it is some crazy destructive thing or a really positive reconstructive thing really depends on how you actually undertake it. But I don't think adding, let's say, iron to the oceans in a careful way, guided by science, would be a bad thing. I think, if anything, it would be a neutral to a good thing, right? I think if it were controlled carefully, studied carefully, and eventually deployed in a responsible way, then I feel positive about it, yeah.
Let's assume we would start adding iron to the Southern Ocean. How much do you think could we grow the Antarctic krill population? Like, could we grow it by 10%, by 50%? And it would be a lot of carbon. There would be a lot of...
Yeah. I mean, I think the issue that you're talking about, when you're talking about growing a population, a species population that's so big, I think the challenge would almost be, how do we have enough ships or planes or whatever it is to actually deploy that amount of iron? And that's like way later down the line. I think before we even get there, we'd need to do some experiments to even see, would it have a positive effect on krill? I suspect it would, but I don't want my suspicions to guide massive sort of deployments. Yeah. And I wouldn't want someone else's suspicions really to guide massive deployments of not just iron, but any sort of adjustment or alteration to any ecosystem, marine or terrestrial. I'd want to see some data first, and I haven't seen any yet, particularly on the effects on organisms like krill, but I have no idea how much the krill population could grow if you added iron. I think it could grow somewhat, but is that somewhat 0.1%? Is it 10%? Is it more? I don't know. And I think when you get to those higher levels, when you're talking about like the orders of percents, 10+%, it will almost be a question of, how do you even deploy that much iron, like at all, to grow a population so large?
One idea by Smetachek actually is to use an old oil tanker and put a sail on it so that it doesn't use any fuel, and just let it distribute the iron here in the Southern Ocean just by like sailing and like slowly adding it. I think the calculation is somewhere between like 2 to 3 million tons of iron via iron sulfate could be deployed in the Southern Ocean to stimulate primary productivity, the krill frill. There is productivity here, right? It could be way more.
Yeah, particularly in the open ocean areas, right? So Antarctica and the islands around Antarctica, the land masses around Antarctica, the upwelling regions around Antarctica have massive amounts of productivity. It's not like there's a lack of productivity.
There's actually a lot going on south of South Africa. I mean, obviously this is model based, so this is like 9th of January. So this is like very recent data.
This right here, I mean, this is where the Agulhas current and the Benguela current meet, right? So this is north of the Southern Ocean, but it's still far offshore here. But you see like the effect of these two water masses meeting and having these big productive plumes down current from them, yeah.
According to my calculation, it could be done with like less than $100 million. So 2 to 3 million tons of iron sulfate. Like you could get it done for like $10 per ton, $20 per ton. Like you need like an old tanker, fill it with iron sulfate, and then let it distribute. But obviously in science, you want to study things, a smaller bioreactor first, a smaller experiment, then go larger. The largest experiment was 100 tons of iron in the North Pacific, though not all of that became bioavailable in the experiment. Right. I think some of that was lost.
Yeah.
So probably it would be sensible to start at like 100 tons or higher, just to get on a larger experiment and get more data than you've gotten before.
And again, I think it really depends on what the goals of your experiment are, right? I mean, if the goals of your experiment are to see the effects of iron fertilization on, for example, krill behavior, reproduction, fecundity, basically how krill respond positively, negatively, or otherwise, then, I mean, yeah, you could have your experiment be 10 tons or 100 tons or 1,000 tons, but the goal is to measure the krill. We know that the phytoplankton will respond because that's been shown again and again, but I want to know how the krill would respond. And if that's a positive thing, then we could try something larger. So it would stage up from there, right? One thing that I want to point out is that when you add iron to when you add any fertilizer, let's just say to an oceanic system like this, but we're talking about iron. So when you add iron to an oceanic system, like the Southern Ocean has the potential to be very, very productive. It already is very, very productive, and it has the potential to be even more productive, like you were talking about. And that's definitely true. However, what we would see, though, I think primarily if we fertilize the Southern Ocean with whatever, let's say, with iron, whatever, is you'd see potentially, well, you see a huge burst in phytoplankton. We know that. Hopefully krill would respond positively and so on. But again, because we talked about this recycling ecosystem, a lot of that new phytoplankton that's drawing in more carbon would be eaten by krill, and then the krill would be eaten by whales, and then that would be recycled. So, but from a carbon capture perspective, it wouldn't sequester as much carbon. A lot of that carbon would stay in the surface ocean, which in terms of carbon sequestration is not where we want that carbon. So if you wanted to sequester carbon via iron fertilization, the better places to do it would be like the equatorial Pacific, where there's not a lot of productivity anyway, where you add iron, which would bloom phytoplankton, but then there would be nothing to eat it. So all that phytoplankton would die and sink. So if your goal is to sequester carbon, that's your primary goal, then I don't think the Southern Ocean is actually the best place to do it. However, if your primary goal is to restore krill populations, hopefully restore blue whale populations, things like that, and then as a side benefit, you do have increases in carbon sequestration via the reinvigorization of the carbon pump, the biological carbon pump, which you talked about earlier, that might happen, but it would take a while to develop. But so when I think about iron additions, and the way that they're either considering being done or, what we're talking about here, I think of it almost as like two almost like separate types of inquiry or experiment. One is you iron fertilize areas of low productivity, oligotrophic waters like the tropical Pacific, like you mentioned. And the goal of that would be to sequester carbon, right? Which would help with climate change, at least ideally, that's the goal. Whereas as compared to doing the same types of experiments in the Southern Ocean, but that would be more of an ecosystem restoration project, I think, than it would be a climate project, right?
I think you're mentioning very, very relevant question, like the big C question, so carbon permanence. And one thing I've always been curious about, and I don't think there are any good models, maybe any good models that have thought about this, about the permanence of each component in the biological carbon pump. So if we follow the carbon journey, so I'm a carbon atom. And me as a carbon atom, I'm like CO2 in the air, and then photosynthesize, I become part of a diatom.
Yeah.
So now I'm in a diatom, and now this diatom is eaten by a krill at the surface. But then my other carbon atom brother is being eaten up at the deep ocean. So we've already learned that the krill just eat them everywhere. So I believe there's going to be a different permanence of me staying in the ocean if I'm being eaten by krill at the surface, let's say a meter deep versus 3,000 meters in depth. So the carbon has a very, very different journey depending on where it's being eaten. And then there's no good models because we haven't done these experiments, and it's probably very hard to measure, very expensive to measure.
Yeah.
But my assumption would be that some of the carbon is sequestered for a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years,
right,
and up to hundreds of years.
Right.
And if we think about climate change, it's all about how quickly can we decarbonize our human activity, how quickly can we decarbonize our electricity supply, and then at some point we'll come up with a number. Do we need 50 years of permanence? Do we need 100 years of permanent? Do we need 150 years, or do we need even more? Depends how much time humans need to decarbonize while still growing in populations as humans,
right,
and still growing as an economy. So personally, I believe 10 years is also helpful. And if we repeat 10 years or 20 years, I think this is a good start. And then we'll get more data over how much of that carbon, what percentage is being drawn down 1,000 years. So there's a lot of different carbon and different forms that will have different permanence in the ocean that may get drawn down into these carbon journeys into the ocean by iron addition. So I think what makes it very hard is, and I think it would be intellectually dishonest to say we can predict with high certainty the carbon permanence of iron addition.
Right.
Likely the model will need a lot of data and will need a lot of assumptions, and it's going to be, depending on the biology, a huge variety. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. If you were to create a model which is intellectually honest, which is accurate, which says, okay, I want to model out the carbon permanence over multiple years, in different organisms,
Right.
how would you approach it?
How
Because
do you do that? Yeah.
that's kind of the way to finance these experiments, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at the carbon is where ultimately the money is, because there's the concern, there's the climate change. It's where that's the currency,
Right.
kind of.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things you mentioned is that a lot of this stuff, in terms of, we could argue about what the level of permanence is that we want. Governments, I think, now have agreed to a permanence of like 100 years being the goal. But like you mentioned earlier, carbon permanence of 10 years is still, it's not nothing. It's better than nothing, right? To suck in more carbon and to capture it, even in the bodies of organisms that'll eventually die and degrade and, give off that carbon, even in 5, 10, 20 years, that's still good for the short term. We can argue about the time scale that's most important. Ideally, we want carbon for climate change. We want carbon to be stored longer rather than less long, right? So if we can demonstrate convincingly that we can do something in some sort of way that can store carbon for 1,000 or 10,000 years, that would be better than if we can only say that carbon can be stored for 10 years. But we can argue about that, or what number should be the number that we should use. But I think one of the bigger concerns is that all these biogeochemical models that sort of look at things like permanence or total amounts of sequestration or conversion of, CO2 or iron to CO2, all these types of different things, is that I don't even want to say oversimplify the biology. They almost don't consider the biology at all. It's really like they take these big physical models, they're looking at ocean currents, they're looking at large ocean variables, which are of course important things to consider. But then when it actually comes down to where the carbon goes, how long it stays there, that is almost invariably going to be reliant on the organisms that are doing the eating and the pooping and the dying and the sinking and the moving, whether it's krill or whales or fish or sharks, it doesn't matter. But these models never consider any of that complexity. And I understand why. It's very complex, right? It's going to be very, very contextually dependent. You're going to have a very different situation on what animals are affecting the biological carbon pump and nutrient recycling in Pacific Atoll versus in the Southern Ocean versus off the coast of California or South Africa. It's all going to be different. And the, biogeochemists, I think, probably don't love that because they just want to have their one model. And I understand that. You want to have your one model that can sort of explain it all, but it just can't be very specific and therefore can't be very useful when you're not considering the biology or the ecology of the species that make up that community at all.
I wholeheartedly agree. Commercially, probably that's where it gets tricky. And I think that's why it's maybe a little bit harder to fund research in the ocean or to fund carbon removal in the ocean, because a buyer may be like a government, university, they want some kind of output. And if the output is, we don't know, but we will get closer to an answer, and there's like a mix of carbon permanence in different locations in the biology and different stages of the biological carbon pump, then it's probably something where science just needs to communicate the potential honestly, but also communicate the complexity and measurement. And I really hope if that is communicated in an intellectually honest way, and if we explain the complexity of biology, and that this is actually still appealing because it has this scale potential. So one of the reasons I like to work in ocean iron fertilization is because the scalability to me seems much higher than any other land-based, electricity-powered industrial version of carbon removal and storage. So the fantasy for me, the ocean has the most fantasy. It's just like the biggest surface area to draw down carbon, to photosynthesize. We do not have an equivalent amount of land available for growing trees and plants. So once we figure out the funding question, I think the funding question is closely connected to the carbon permanence question. And I think we just have to be honest, and we just have to communicate the complexity and the scale it can achieve temporarily, like the 10, 20-year scale, but also like the hundreds of year scale. I think then that hopefully unlocks the funding that is required to measure. Doing anything in the ocean is very expensive. You need a boat, you need like complex instruments. Ocean experiments have been historically the most expensive ones. Yeah,
I mean, one thing I just wanted to interject quickly to say that the answer is going to be complex, but would the investors rather the sort of nuanced answer, the answer with more complexity, but one that is more honest and therefore correct? Or would they rather just deal with individuals or other companies, carbon capture organizations that say, oh, we could totally capture this amount of carbon for this amount of years, which is, I think, almost always going to be just greenwashed and lies or just lacking evidence whatsoever because we just don't have the data for it. And that's actually one of the big issues in the carbon credit market now, is that we don't have any sort of verification of, in fact, is this carbon going to be permanent for 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years? And so if you just give a simple answer to an investor like that, it might be what they want to hear, but it's not going to necessarily be true. So would your investor rather hear the truth, or would they rather hear a convenient answer for them? That's really what it comes down to.
So to answer the question of what investors in carbon credits want to hear, ideally, I would really like to believe ideologically that they're okay with the nuanced answer and that it's complex and that it's partially model-based and it's worth exploring it and it's worth putting in money today in order to get an answer on this long-term question. I'm not sure if that's the reality of it. I think there's a lot of methodologies that oversell their predictability of permanence on shore, but also oversell their predictability in the ocean. I believe all methodologies are flawed. I think all methodologies have questions around permanence and they all simplify, and some of them became very popular because they simplified. So commercially, probably to simplify and just give like a top line answer maybe has been successful in the past, but no matter the methodology, all the methodologies today are very low scale. So we haven't scaled any methodology. Right. So maybe one approach is to just simplify, make it easy for the buyers, and then become more nuanced the more we scale and give better answers the more we scale. I'm not sure what the right business strategy. I would certainly like to be honest. I do really like intellectual honesty. I think that's something that science is all about.
No, I mean, and I think, and again, this is the business side of this is of course not where I have any sort of experience, but what I would think is kind of like any sort of startup, you'd want to demonstrate efficacy on a small scale. And then if I were an investor, I would see that, I'd give you some amount. And I'd say, well, we could give you this amount, but I'd want to see efficacy on a small scale, and then we could do a medium scale, and then we could do a large scale, right? And that's the way that I would approach this, And I think one of the exciting things about ocean fertilization, whether it's with iron or any other types of limiting nutrients in other regions of the ocean, is that you can think about returns on that investment in a number of different ways. We've been talking about carbon, but what about in terms of number of fish catch, fish stocks, right? We have been fertilizing the land for millennia, right? Whether it's with animal waste or in the last, 100 years or so, synthetic fertilizer. And that's allowed sort of our agricultural production to increase 100-fold, orders of magnitude, because we've been fertilizing the land. Now, we've been over-fertilizing the land. There's been lots of problems around too much land conversion, too much fertilizer use, and so on. But you compare that to the ocean, where we've done basically none of that. And I think if it were done in a careful, responsible way, again, guided by science like we're talking about, there is huge potential to essentially farm the ocean in a way that is both sustainable and helpful for both the ocean and coastal communities that rely on it.
Yeah, so in the open ocean, I always had this dream of maybe one day introducing kind of like an iron law. So if I'm a big fisheries company and I go out fishing in iron limited waters and I remove fish and thereby also remove more iron from the ocean food web, that maybe once we have the data, once we have the scientific experiments, that next to the engine there needs to be a little bit of like a small iron release so that we have like some way to restore what we take out. So every time I take out something of the system, I need to
put something back in.
That would be like the maybe in 10-20 year vision, where like it's all about complying in certain areas of the ocean with some kind of law. That would be the the long term.
Well, it makes sense to me, I mean, in general, because we think about humans' relationship with nature, and this is more true on the ocean than it is at land, but it really is just like a one-way street. We just take and take and take, and we really don't give anything back. And that's not going to be sustainable for much longer on a planet with 8, 9, 10 billion people. We need to think about how to rejuvenate ecosystems. And these are ecosystems that have nourished us for millennia, right? And now we are sort of in the last basically several hundred years, we are overtaxing those ecosystems on a global scale. And one of the reasons why is because of this one-way street of extraction, where we just extract resources, water, nutrients, fish, other types of protein, and we don't put anything back. Now, is the answer to that to dump a bunch of iron in the ocean? I don't know. It's probably more complex than that. But the point is that thinking about these systems can rejuvenate themselves up to a point, but we are taxing these systems beyond the point where they can naturally rejuvenate themselves. And that's something that's fairly new within the last 100 to 200 years.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I mean, especially this point, I'm not sure if you have any data on that. We've had rising sea levels, but they were still kind of moderate. But I think once we hit this sort of tipping point in Greenland, there might be like a moment in which the ice doesn't refreeze.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the sea levels are rising rapidly. And suddenly it's going to be like multiple centimeters per year, not like today,
yeah.
which is going to be devastating for island nations that will be underwater. They won't have any like fresh water supply left anymore. And my point of view is like our current like climate action should be all like modeled around that. We should try to prevent that tipping point in Greenland. That one needs to be prevented, the rapid melting of the ice, in order to prevent like the sea level rise.
Yeah, I totally agree. Greenland and Antarctica, those are the two, you know, when they start losing land ice sheets in a real way, then we're going to see a reshaping of basically planetary geography in a way that the human species has never experienced before. I mean, you could say between glacial cycles, maybe we have experienced drastic reshaping of geography, but since the last glacial period, you know, of about 15,000 years ago or so, we have not seen anything in modern history like what would occur if we start melting the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, and they are at a tipping point. And one of the first things we talked about, right, was not just like the amount of change, but the rate of change. And so one of the things that you mentioned that it concerns me as well is that tipping point, right, that we reach some point of no return where the rate of ice loss and therefore sea level rise goes so rapid that you just can't do it. It's like a runaway train at that point. And we're very, very close to that point. Science can't tell us exactly when that point will be reached. It's all just kind of predictions with various degrees of certainty, but we don't know. And I don't think we want to find that out. And so that's why I think there's been so much sort of action thinking about ways that we can, you know, sequester carbon and get business models in play that can really push capital into carbon sequestration and biodiversity credits and things like this. Whether or not you agree with it as a scientist, I know many scientists don't like the monetization of the Earth's natural resources and ecosystem services, but I think the reality is that, you know, money is how our current world operates. Whether or not we like it is not relevant for this situation. And so if we can figure out ways to bring in big investment dollars into these sorts of areas, then we could really drive planetary change very, very rapidly. And that's really what we need right now.
Yeah, I think what scientists have seen historically is that there's this very strong correlation of commercialization has always worked against nature.
Yes.
So the more humans, the less natures. The ocean is kind of the last bastion of non-commercialized surface on the planet. A third of the planet has been commercialized, everything onshore, on land, but the ocean hasn't been touched yet. So I think scientists are always very, very afraid, like, okay, don't touch this last part of Mother Nature, because historically onshore, it always went wrong. And even if you do it in a like careful way, which is obviously like a science guided is our proposal, in the past, at least with humans, it always spiraled out of control.
Yes.
And that's why I think they've been very hostile towards obtaining these initial data steps. So basically there's been like, let's say, a group of scientists that say, why don't we just try to prevent any kind of experiments so that we don't even get close to commercialization of the ocean. So it would be strategically better to not have any data at all, even if the data is like comparable to a fire extinguisher. You know, we're obtaining data on experiments that we don't scale up yet, but at least we know the effects, and that even hasn't been done. So if I'm anti-ocean commercialization, it's probably the right strategy. There's no experiments at all. It's like the right amount of experiments, because then we are getting further away from commercialization. I technically believe it would be better to have the data at least, and to have the optionality as humans. The more optionality we have, the better we can make data-driven decisions. You're deeper into the world of ocean conservation and science, you're probably closer to the emotions that people have.
I do. Yes. I do understand exactly what you're saying. And I think that is a widely sort of held belief among scientists that if we, particularly from a capitalist business standpoint, we almost always wreck everything. And that's because the motivations of capitalism, particularly without strong regulations, do not work in terms of sustainability or conservation. Capitalism is driven, right, by how you can make the most money as quickly as possible, right? And that is at odds with the way an ecosystem works, right? So ecosystems do produce things and produce things regularly, but at such time scales that is not quick enough for businesses, right? And so I think we need sort of a reorientation or a reframing from the business side of what we can expect from nature, what we hope to expect from nature, and basically a re-understanding from just anyone, business people or the general public, of how much nature provides us. Not just the cool documentaries that we see on the BBC or anything like that, but also the services, the oxygen that we breathe, the fish that we eat, and so on. And so if we lose these systems, we lose us. I mean, like humanity will collapse without a healthy ocean. And so we've waited to the point where I don't think we can really wait anymore. And we could wait around until all the ice caps melt and we burn every bit of fossil fuel that we have. And, every bit of forested land and on the planet is engulfed in wildfires, and tropical cyclones and hurricanes, dominate all of our coasts in ways never seen before. So we can wait for all those moments, or we can try to take assertive, proactive actions and, hope that we can work with business leaders, work with governments to move forward in a way that is sustainability first. Now, because understandably so, a lot of the things that scientists are worried about is that every time we've interacted with a system, we've destroyed it, right? And you mentioned that, and that's true. One hope that I have is that a lot of that exploitation and extraction happened before we understood that the Earth and its resources were not inexhaustible. A lot of that extraction happened in the early 20th century, the mid 20th century. And there was this environmental revolution that happened starting in the 60s and 70s, where we kind of had this global sort of aha moment where scientists kind of all at the same time, in a way, were like, oh, we can't keep doing this at the scale that we've been doing this and expect the planet to be around in the same way for much longer. So we need to start this transition toward regrowing ecosystems, rehabilitating systems, sustainability. So the sustainability mindset, which is now all the rage nowadays in 2025, really started back in the 60s and 70s. And since then, we've understood that we need to have this sort of conservation, sustainability mindset with nature, much more so than we have prior to that. I think we just have to be really careful about how we move forward, because the corporations and businesses and those with lots of money do hold inordinate amounts of power. And so if it's not well constrained to protect and conserve environments, ecosystems, and the ocean, then yes, they will be completely destroyed for the sake of short-term profits. So we have to be extremely careful. There's no doubt about that.
Right. So maybe on that note, we'll end. Let's obtain some more data.
Yeah.
Let's see how we can maybe help krill.
Totally.
The whales.
More data. No, there's no information is power, and there's no harm in getting more information. I think that's absolutely true.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks so much.
This has been great.